During the party, my son-in-law was laughing. People in rags don't belong here. When I arrived 90 minutes late, wearing a shirt torn at the shoulder, an older man seated at his table stood up, looked straight at me and said, "Sir?" Everyone was stunned. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The silence in my apartment has a weight to it, a familiar pressure that settled in 5 years ago and never truly left. It's the shape of Anna's absence. I move through it, a ghost in my own life, tracing the quiet rhythms we once shared. The coffee pot gurgles at 6 a.m. The worn armchair sighs when I sit. Her photograph on the mantelpiece, a smile frozen in a happier time, is my most loyal companion. It's a simple life, a quiet one, built within the modest walls that feel more like a sanctuary with each passing year. Then the phone rang, its shrill cry piercing the calm like a thrown rock. An unfamiliar number, but I recognized the Covington area code. A knot tightened in my gut. I knew before I answered. "Hello? Raymond, it's Gregory." My son-in-law's voice was as cold and sterile as a surgical instrument. No warmth, no preamble. Gregory Harrington did not waste pleasantries on liabilities. "Gregory," I said, my own voice flat, betraying nothing. "Mother's birthday is this Friday," he stated, not asked. "We're having dinner at the Highland Club. Sophia wants you there." Sophia wants you there, not we want you there. The distinction was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. It was always for Sophia, my daughter, the beautiful, fragile bridge between my world of worn hands and honest labor and their world of polished silver and casual cruelty. "I see," I said, a brief calculated pause on his end. "It's at 7, don't be late." He wasn't finished. "And Raymond, the club has standards. I trust you'll be appropriate." The words landed not like punches, but like the slow, deliberate press of a thumb on a fresh bruise. Appropriate. He meant my 10-year-old Honda Civic with the G774E plates parked outside. He meant the calluses on my hands that no amount of soap could soften. He meant my very existence, which was a constant low-grade embarrassment to him and his parents. I could hear the echo of his father, Victor, from years ago, his voice dripping with false concern. "We just worry about the impression it gives, Raymond." I knew this invitation wasn't for me. It was the result of a battle Sophia had fought and partially won in the marble-floored halls of their mansion. She had likely begged, perhaps even cried, just to get her father a seat at the table. This reluctant summons was my prize. The old familiar sting of their disdain was sharp, a taste like rust in the back of my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to stay here in my quiet fortress where Anna's memory was a shield. But then I pictured Sophia's face, her hopeful, anxious eyes. I pictured her sitting at that long, polished table, glancing at the empty chair beside her, her spirit sinking under the weight of her husband's victory. That was a pain I couldn't bear. My pride was a stubborn, bony thing, but my love for her was the marrow inside. "I'll be there, Gregory," I said, the words costing me more than he could ever comprehend. "Good," he clipped back, the relief in his voice that a scene had been avoided palpable. "Don't embarrass us." The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the simple phone feeling as heavy as a block of lead in my hand. The silence of the apartment rushed back in, but it was different now, tainted with dread. I looked around at the clean, humble space I had carved out for myself. It was a world away from the Highland Club, a world that had no interest in me, a world I now had to prepare for. I had to find an outfit that wouldn't scream charity case and a gift for Margaret Harrington that was expensive enough to be acknowledged, yet would never be good enough to be appreciated. It was a losing battle, I knew. But for Sophia, it was a battle I had to show up for. The battle began in my closet. I pushed aside my work clothes, the familiar scent of worn cotton and Columbus air clinging to them. My options for business casual, as Gregory had so clinically put it, were limited. I pulled out my best shirt, a pale blue button-down. Its collar was beginning to fray, a subtle fringe of wear that I'd never noticed until now. My hands, clumsy and thick from decades of construction work, struggled with the hanger. I remembered Anna's fingers, so nimble and sure, deftly turning a collar or pressing a seam with the iron. She'd always made sure I looked my best, her love stitched into the very fabric of my clothes. Standing there, I felt the sharp pang of her absence and the hollowness of my own preparation. This shirt, once mended with love, now felt like a testament to my inadequacy. The mall was an assault on the senses. Gleaming floors reflected a constellation of bright, artificial lights. The air, thick with a dozen competing perfumes, felt thin and hard to breathe. I moved through the throng of shoppers, a ghost from another era, my simple needs and worn shoes out of place in this temple of excess. I was heading toward a specialty food store, the kind that sells cheese that costs more per pound than a tank of gas, when a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Ray, what are you doing in this part of town? Your GPS broken?" I turned to see Jack leaning against his minivan, a fellow Uber driver with a laugh that could fill a stadium. He saw me heading for the store's glittering entrance. "Don't tell me you're buying one of those fancy gift baskets," he said, a grin splitting his face. "You win the lottery?" "Something like that," I said, managing a weak smile. "In-laws?" Jack's grin softened into a look of understanding. He knew about the Harringtons. "Ah, the Covington Royals. Listen, Ray," he said, his voice dropping a little. "You don't owe those people anything. Just be you. That's more than they've got." He clapped me on the shoulder, a simple, solid gesture of camaraderie that felt more real than anything inside this mall. "You need a ride back, you call me." His words were a small comfort, but they faded as I entered the store. I found what I was looking for, a wicker basket overflowing with imported crackers, exotic jams, and wine bottles so ornate they looked like they belonged in a museum. The price tag read $148, more than 2 full days of driving fares. I handed over my credit card, the act feeling like a surrender. Carrying the ridiculous basket back to my Civic, the memory I'd been suppressing finally broke through. It was 5 years ago, just 2 months after we'd buried Anna. Sophia and Gregory were pushing forward with their wedding plans. I'd met with the Harringtons at their real estate development office, a place of cold glass and steel that perfectly matched their personalities. I had gently suggested, my voice still raw with grief, that perhaps they could postpone. Victor had cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. "Raymond, a wedding of this scale involves deposits, vendors, commitments. It's not so simple to just move." Margaret, however, was the one who delivered the killing blow. She'd looked at me, her eyes devoid of anything resembling sympathy, and asked about my plans now that the construction work had dried up. I told her I was driving for Uber. I'll never forget the look on her face, a flicker of disgust masked by a thin veil of condescension. She glanced at Sophia, whose face was already flushed with shame, before turning back to me. "An Uber driver," she'd said, the words hanging in the sterile air. She gave a small, tight smile. "How practical." Practical. The word was a dismissal, a judgment, a branding. It declared me small and common, a service to be used, not a man to be respected. The memory of Sophia's mortified expression, her inability to meet my eyes, was the sharpest part of the wound. I set the basket on the passenger seat of my Honda. It looked alien, a gaudy invader in my humble car. The pressure in my chest was immense, a mix of old pain and fresh anger. But underneath it, something else was hardening. Jack was wrong. I did owe someone something. I owed it to Sophia to walk into that den of vipers and show her that her father, the practical Uber driver, was not a man who could be so easily broken. This wasn't about impressing the Harringtons. This was about showing my daughter that my worth wasn't determined by their standards. The drive from Columbus to Covington is a straight shot down the highway, a gray ribbon of asphalt that gives a man far too much time to think. With the ridiculous wicker basket sitting on the passenger seat like an unwelcome guest, my mind churned, replaying the highlight reel of my inadequacies as curated by the Harringtons. Gregory's voice on the phone, cold and clinical. The club has standards. Margaret's face from 5 years ago. A mask of polite revulsion at the wedding that felt more like a business merger. How practical. The memories were ghosts, riding along with me in my 10-year-old Honda, its G774E plates a humble identifier in a world that valued flashover substance. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, a beautiful sight that I was in no mood to appreciate. I was a lamb driving myself to the slaughter, armed with nothing but a frayed collar and a basket of overpriced cheese. It was on a desolate stretch of road just outside Covington, where the streetlights were sparse and the fields on either side had been swallowed by the encroaching dusk, that I saw it. The flashing hazard lights of a sedan were a frantic, lonely pulse in the gloom. The car was pulled over at a dangerous angle, half on the shoulder. As I slowed, the scene snapped into sharp, terrifying focus and the blood in my veins ran cold. 3 large men were aggressively surrounding a young woman. They had her backed against the passenger door of their own car, and even from a distance I could see the sheer panic in her movements as she struggled against their advances. She had clearly been waiting for a taxi that wasn't coming and had found something much worse. Every thought of the Harringtons, of Margaret's party, of my own wounded pride evaporated. All I saw was a girl about Sophia's age in terrible trouble. A primal protective instinct, the one that's hardwired into every father, took complete control. I yanked the wheel, pulling my Civic onto the shoulder behind their car, my headlights cutting through the darkness and pinning them in the unforgiving glare. I got out, leaving my door ajar. "Everything all right over here?" I called out, my voice holding a steadiness I didn't feel. The 3 of them turned, their faces a mixture of annoyance and surprise. The one closest to the woman sneered. "Mind your own business, old man. Get back in your car before you get hurt." "I don't think I will," I said, walking toward them at a measured pace. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but years of hauling steel and balancing on high beams had taught me how to plant my feet and not give an inch. My hands, calloused and thick, hung at my sides. They weren't the hands of a fighter, but they were the hands of a man who had worked, and they didn't look soft. The woman, who was visibly frightened, saw her chance. "I don't know them," she cried out. "Please help me." That was all I needed. "Let her go," I said, my voice low and final. The leader, a beefy man with a shaved head, shoved her toward his friend and took a menacing step toward me. "Or what?" he spat, grabbing the front of my shirt. It was a classic bully's move meant to intimidate. I stood firm, and with a sharp, angry tug, the fabric of my good blue shirt ripped at the shoulder seam. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet evening. In that instant, I pulled out my phone, holding it up. "That's assault," I said, my voice now loud and ringing with authority. "I'm on the phone with the police right now. They have my location, and I've got a clear view of your license plate." They froze. For a long, tense moment, they looked at each other, the bravado draining from their faces as they weighed the consequences. The bluff worked. The man holding me let go with a curse, and the 3 of them scrambled back into their car like rats. A moment later, they squealed their tires on the asphalt and vanished into the night. The young woman, whose name I soon learned was Isabel, sagged against her car, sobbing with relief. I approached her cautiously. "Are you certain you're okay, miss?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. She was still trembling, clutching her arms around herself. I think so. Just shaken." "Thank you, sir. I don't know what I would have done." Her voice was soft, refined. "Raymond. My name's Raymond." "Raymond," she repeated, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. "I'm Isabel. Thank you, Raymond. Really, you saved me." "Just glad I was in the right place at the right time," I said. "You were waiting for a taxi, weren't you? That's rough out here." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes. My friends. We were at a party and I was supposed to get a ride, but things got messy. My phone died, of course." She gestured vaguely. "I work in investment analysis downtown Covington. Today was a celebration. Bad choice for a late-night pickup, I guess." "Investment analysis, huh?" I chuckled softly. "Sounds like a complicated business. My own girl, Sophia, she's about your age, 20-something. Married 5 years now. Always worried about her out in the world. Being a father, it changes you." "You have a daughter?" Isabel's eyes softened. That's really kind of you, Raymond. Most people wouldn't have even stopped, let alone risked their safety." "Well, sometimes people need a little help," I said, shrugging. "Doesn't matter who they are." When we pulled up to the address she gave me, I realized we were in one of Covington's most exclusive neighborhoods. It was a sprawling stone mansion set far back from the road, with perfectly manicured lawns and a fountain lit by soft, elegant lights. As she prepared to get out, she fumbled in her purse and pulled out a thick wad of cash, several $100s at least. "Please," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have to take this. For the shirt. For everything." I looked at the money in her hand, then at her earnest, tired face. I thought of Jack's words in the parking lot. "Just be you." I gently pushed her hand away. "No, thank you, Isabel," I said. "Sometimes people need help. That's all." She looked at me, her eyes shining in the dim light. "My father, William Hayes, is never going to believe this. He always says character is what you do when no one is watching." "Thank you, sir. Truly." I just nodded, a strange sense of peace settling over me. I watched her walk safely to her magnificent front door, then pulled away. I was now 45 minutes late. My shirt was torn, a visible mark of the night's chaos. By every standard the Harringtons held dear, I was an even bigger disaster than when I had left home. But for the first time all day, the knot of dread in my stomach was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid sense of purpose. The battle ahead no longer seemed so daunting. The Highland Club was not a building. It was a statement. A sprawling, manicured estate of stone and dark timber that looked down on the rest of Covington with an air of hereditary disdain. I pulled my Honda into the parking lot, a minnow swimming into a pod of whales. It was a sea of gleaming German luxury sedans and sleek Italian sports cars, each one costing more than my apartment and everything in it. The valet, a young man in a crisp uniform, gave my car a look that was a masterclass in polite contempt before gesturing me to a distant, poorly lit corner. I understood. The G774E didn't belong here. I slipped on the cheap, thin jacket I kept in the back for emergencies, the polyester shell a pathetic attempt to conceal the gash in my good shirt. Carrying the ostentatious gift basket, I walked toward the grand entrance, the sounds of muted laughter and clinking glasses growing louder. Margaret Harrington greeted me just inside the door. She was draped in a silk dress the color of money, her face a carefully constructed mask of hospitality that cracked the moment she saw me. Her eyes swept over my jacket, my worn shoes, my tired face, and her smile thinned into a razor's edge. "Raymond," she said, her voice dripping with frost, "you're late." Gregory and Victor materialized beside her, a united front of tailored disapproval. Gregory's jaw was clenched, his eyes burning with a familiar shame. Victor, ever the patriarch, looked at me with the weary disappointment of a CEO reviewing a catastrophic quarterly report. 45 minutes, Raymond, Gregory said, his voice low and furious. We're already on the main course. I'm very sorry, I began, the heavy basket suddenly feeling like a fool's offering. I had to stop and help someone on the road. There was a difficult situation. Victor scoffed, a soft, dismissive sound. A situation, he repeated, adjusting his cufflinks. Raymond, these sorts of things always seem to find certain types of people. One must learn to avoid them. The words were designed to strip me of my dignity, to reduce me to my torn shirt and my old car, to classify me as something unseemly. Just then, Sophia rushed over, her face pale with worry. Dad, I was so worried. You're here. She took my arm, a small, warm anchor in a cold sea. Mother, please, he's here now. Let's just sit down. Margaret waved a dismissive hand, adorned with a diamond that could probably pay off my mortgage. Sophia, dear, go and see to our guests. Your father and I are having a conversation. She turned her full, icy attention back to me, her voice rising just enough to cut through the nearby chatter and draw the eyes of the surrounding tables. The air grew still. This was her stage, and I was the evening's entertainment. I have hosted this party for my friends and family for 25 years, she announced, her voice ringing with theatrical indignation. In all that time, every single guest has shown the basic courtesy of arriving on time and dressed with a modicum of respect. For the occasion, for the club, and for me. She took a step back, gesturing to my entire being with a sweep of her hand. You arrived late, looking like you've been dragged through a hedge, and you expect to sit at my table with our friends, with our business partners? She let the question hang in the air, a public indictment. I saw Sophia shrink, her hand flying to her mouth. Her friend, Eleanor, put a comforting arm around her. The humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over me. I could feel the stares, the whispers, the smirks. This was what they had always wanted, to prove publicly that I did not belong, that I was less than them, and in that fire something inside me, something that had been worn down by years of quiet endurance, finally hardened into steel. The pain was there, sharp and deep, especially for my daughter. But beneath it, a strange, cold calm settled over me. The memory of Isabel's terror, of the rightness of my choice to stop, of her simple, profound gratitude. It was a shield. Their judgment was hollow. Margaret delivered the final killing blow. Let me be perfectly clear, Raymond. If you can't be bothered to dress like a human being, then you will not sit at the table with human beings. The words echoed in the sudden silence. I looked past her at Sophia, whose eyes were filled with tears of helpless shame. I saw her turn to Eleanor, her shoulders shaking as she whispered, I can't believe she did that, in front of everyone. I brought my gaze back to Margaret. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply met her cruel, triumphant stare. You're right, Margaret, I said, my voice quiet but clear. I don't belong at this table. I placed the $148 gift basket on the floor beside her, turned my back on her, on Gregory's fury and Victor's smug satisfaction, and began to walk toward the door. I was no longer a victim enduring a punishment. I was a man making a choice. My patience had finally run out. Each step toward the heavy oak doors was a step away from years of quiet submission. The humiliation still burned, but it was a distant heat now, cauterized by a cold, clean calm. I was done. I risked a final glance back, not at my tormentors, but at my daughter. Sophia was leaning against a marble column, her shoulders shaking, her friend Eleanor holding her steady. At least my daughter had one true friend in this viper's nest, I thought, a small, grateful acknowledgement in the storm of my own emotions. The sight of Sophia's pain was a knife in my gut, but my leaving was the only thing I could do for her now. To remove the target of her in-laws' contempt, I was 3 feet from the door, my hand reaching for the ornate brass handle, when a voice cut through the stifling silence of the room. "Excuse me, sir." It wasn't loud, but it had a weight that made the clinking of ice and glasses and the rustle of silk stop dead. I turned. From the main table, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 60s was rising to his feet. He had an air of calm authority that made him the instant center of the room. "I must apologize for the interruption, Margaret," the man said, his voice carrying effortlessly. "But I had a rather frantic call from my daughter Isabel earlier this evening. A second call just a few moments ago thankfully confirmed she is now safe." He paused, letting his words settle. "She is safe thanks to the actions of a genuine hero." The atmosphere in the room shifted from awkward tension to rapt attention. Margaret, however, saw an opportunity to cement her victory, to justify the scene she had just created. She gave a small, condescending laugh. "William, how dreadful for your daughter. But I think there must be some mistake," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern as she gestured vaguely in my direction. "As you can see, we were just dealing with a rather unseemly situation ourselves. One must be so careful. A true hero is one thing, but a man of a certain type is quite another. I'm sure you understand." The man, William Hayes, as he had introduced himself, regarded her with an unreadable expression. He seemed completely unfazed by her interruption. "On the contrary, Margaret, I don't think there is any mistake at all. My daughter, you see, is meticulous. She was frightened, but she was observant. She noted the make of the car that stopped for her. An older model Honda Civic." My heart hammered in my chest. Beside me, I heard a sharp intake of breath from Gregory. Hayes's eyes, sharp and intelligent, now fixed directly on me. And she was clever enough to remember the license plate. G774E. My license plate. The room seemed to tilt, the blood pounded in my ears. As dozens of pairs of eyes swung from Hayes to me, a panicked whisper cut through the silence from the Harringtons' table. It was Victor, his voice a strangled rasp directed at his son. "The Hayes account. Dear God, Gregory, that's the biggest investment opportunity of the year." And just like that, the final greasy piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just a guest. This was their potential savior, or their impending doom. Hayes's gaze held mine. "Raymond, is it?" he asked, his voice now gentle. "Is that your vehicle?" All I could do was nod, my throat too tight to speak. "Yes," I finally managed the word, barely a whisper. "It is." The reaction from the Harringtons was a silent, magnificent explosion of horror. Margaret's painted smile didn't so much fall as it shattered, leaving behind a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. Victor went a shade of gray I'd previously only seen on unmixed concrete, his hand frozen midway to his wine glass. And Gregory looked as if the floor had given way beneath him, his face a ghastly collage of dawning comprehension and absolute panic. They had just publicly crucified the man who had saved the daughter of the most important person in their financial universe. William Hayes's calm demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp disapproval that was more intimidating than any shouting could ever be. He looked from me to the Harringtons and his face hardened. The party was over. A trial had begun. "So let me see if I have this straight, Margaret Victor," he said, his voice now laced with ice. "The man you just publicly castigated for his appearance, the man whose very presence you deemed an insult to your standards, is the same man who risked his own safety for my child not an hour ago?" He took a step away from the table, his gaze sweeping over them like a searchlight. "I believe your exact words were, 'If you can't be bothered to dress like a human being, then you will not sit at the table with human beings.' Is that about right?" The quote hung in the dead air, a glittering, venomous jewel of their own making. The Harringtons stood frozen, judged not by me but by their own greed and cruelty, their faces illuminated by the horrified stares of every guest they had sought so desperately to impress. The dead air in the room was a vacuum, sucking all the warmth and laughter out of the Highland Club. The Harringtons stood as if flash-frozen, their faces a gallery of ruin. Margaret's was a rictus of disbelief, Victor's a mask of ashen terror, and Gregory's a look of such profound and utter panic that it was almost pitiful. For 5 years their world had been my prison, now it had become theirs. William Hayes let his words hang in the air for a moment longer, a judge allowing the weight of the verdict to sink in. Then he turned his gaze to me. It was not a look of pity, but of profound respect. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice now calm and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos he had unleashed. "My daughter told me you refused any form of payment for your help. She said your shirt was torn in the process of defending her. It seems to me you came directly here from that encounter." He gestured to my cheap jacket and the visible rip beneath it. "You were late not because you lacked respect for your hosts, but because you were showing respect for a stranger in need. You were disheveled not because you lacked standards, but because you upheld a standard of decency that seems to be in very short supply in this room tonight." He turned his attention back to the Harringtons, his voice hardening once more. "You speak of standards, Margaret. You, Victor. You're concerned with appearances, with the make of a man's car and the label on his suit. You believe these are the things that define a person's worth." He swept a hand across the room at the glittering diamonds and the hushed, watching faces. "For the past hour, my associate Mr. Henderson and I have been listening to you talk about your new real estate venture. You talk about quality, integrity, and building a legacy." At the mention of his name, a quiet, silver-haired man sitting next to Hayes, Mr. Henderson, gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it carried the finality of a gavel strike. Victor finally found his voice, a desperate, strangled sound. "William, please. It was a misunderstanding. A terrible, terrible misunderstanding. We had no idea." "No idea of what, Victor?" Hayes cut him off, his voice sharp as a shard of glass. "That the man you were belittling was the father-in-law of your son? You knew that? That his daughter, your daughter-in-law, was being hurt by your words? You saw that? Or did you have no idea that your guest of honor was watching? Is that it? Is your character only present when you think someone important is looking?" He shook his head, a look of genuine disgust on his face. "I founded my company on a simple principle. We invest in people first and ideas second. The financials of your proposal were sound, promising even. But I will not, under any circumstances, partner with people who are so fundamentally bankrupt in character. I will not attach my name, my reputation, or my capital to a firm run by individuals who mistake cruelty for class and arrogance for strength." The final blow landed with devastating precision. "Therefore," William Hayes announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality, "as of this moment, any and all consideration of an investment by Hayes Capital in the Harrington development firm is permanently withdrawn. We are no longer interested." A collective gasp went through the room. Margaret let out a small, wounded sound, like a balloon slowly deflating. Gregory looked at his father, his face pleading, but Victor could only stare at William Hayes, the architect of his ruin. The empire they had so carefully constructed, built on a foundation of snobbery and exclusion, had just been demolished by the quiet integrity of a man in a 10-year-old Honda. I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of revenge. The feeling that washed over me was quieter, deeper. It was vindication. It was the quiet, profound relief of a weight being lifted, a weight I had carried for 5 long years. I thought of Anna, of her quiet strength and her unwavering belief in doing the right thing, and I knew she would have been proud. Not of the Harringtons' downfall, but of the fact that I had, in the end, simply been myself. The world had turned itself right side up again, not because I had fought back, but because a truth had been revealed. That character, the thing you do when no one is watching, is the only standard that truly matters. The aftermath was not a roar, but a hurried, mortified whisper. Guests who moments before had been sipping Margaret's expensive champagne now avoided her eyes, murmuring clipped goodbyes as they scurried for the exits. The Harringtons stood in the ruins of their own making, a tableau of public disgrace. Margaret's face was a collapsed mask of makeup and disbelief. Victor stared into the middle distance, seeing, I imagined, the smoldering wreckage of his business aspirations. And Gregory, my son-in-law, finally looked at me, his eyes holding not anger, but a dawning, hollowed-out understanding of the chasm that had just opened beneath his feet. Just as the room began to clear, Sophia broke away from Eleanor and rushed to my side. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a shame that wasn't hers to carry. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "For them. For everything. I never should have asked you to come." I pulled her into a hug, my hand gently patting her back. The cheap jacket and torn shirt didn't matter. "This has nothing to do with you, sweetheart," I said softly, my voice for her ears alone. "You have a good and loving heart. That's a greater treasure than anything in this entire club. Never let them take that from you." William Hayes approached us, his associate Mr. Henderson a respectful step behind. He gave Sophia a kind, sympathetic smile before turning to me. "Mr. Reed," he said, ignoring the Harrington wreckage entirely. "That was a distasteful performance, and I, for one, have lost my appetite for the hospitality here. Would you do me the honor of allowing me to buy you dinner? A proper one." I looked from this powerful, decent man to my daughter, who nodded through her tears. "I'll be fine, Dad," she said. "Go." I accepted his offer with a simple nod. As we walked toward the door, leaving the Harringtons to face the consequences of their spectacular implosion, William Hayes paused. "My car is out front," he said. "I'd be honored if you'd ride with me. We can send someone back for your Honda." We went to a steakhouse on a quiet side street, the kind of place Anna and I would have saved up for on a special anniversary. It was all dark wood, soft lighting, and the rich, honest smell of grilled steak. There was no pretense here, only the quiet murmur of conversation and the comfortable weight of a good meal. Over thick, perfectly cooked ribeyes we talked. Not about business or investments, but about life. He told me more about Isabel, her sharp mind and her kind heart. I told him about Sophia, about her gentle spirit and the fierce love I had for her. And then he looked at me, his expression softening. "My wife, Catherine. She passed away 8 years ago," he said quietly. "She was the one who kept me grounded. She had no time for the kind of nonsense we saw tonight. She would have liked you, Raymond, and she would have adored what you did for our Isabel." In that moment, a bond was formed, one far deeper than a chance encounter on a dark road. We were 2 widowers, 2 fathers, 2 men who understood that the things you can't buy are the only things worth having. When he dropped me back at the Highland Club to pick up my car, he didn't give me a business card. He took out a pen and wrote a number on a plain cocktail napkin. "This is my personal cell, Raymond," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Call me. Let's have dinner again, without the drama. The drive home to Columbus felt different. The city lights didn't seem lonely. They seemed welcoming. My small apartment greeted me not with a heavy silence, but with the quiet comfort of a true sanctuary. The weight I had carried for 5 years, the familiar pressure of Anna's absence mixed with the sting of the Harringtons' contempt, was finally gone. In its place, there was only peace. I looked at the photograph of Anna on the mantelpiece, her smile as bright as ever. For the first time in a long time, I smiled back without a shadow of sadness. I realized that true wealth isn't measured in stock portfolios or social standing. It's measured in the quiet integrity of your choices, in the strength of your character. It's in a torn shirt on the side of a dark road, and in the newfound peace of a quiet apartment that finally completely felt like home. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.